Hi, guys, and welcome to How Microsoft Keeps Engineers Happy and Productive in the Age of Hybrid Work. This is part of our Future of Work webinar series. And of course, in this case, we're in the current era that was ushered in by the COVID pandemic. Today, we're going to be featuring Brian Houck, who's the Principal Productivity Engineer at Microsoft. I'm Jared, I'm the Content Manager at Unleash, and I'll be your host today. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping. We have some people joining from multiple platforms. For your platform of choice, anytime you have a comment or a question, just write it in the comment of whatever platform you're using, and we're going to practice right now. So, and if you join our other webinars, you know what's coming. Where are you chiming in from today? Write it in the comments, and we should see it in the chat. Guys, today you're not going to see a lot of my face. Today is about Brian. He's going to be talking about productivity and software development and some of his research around it. And that's our cue for Brian to join, as well as Unleash CEO Egil Ustis. Hey, guys.
Hey there. Welcome, Brian. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this.
Absolutely. So I'm very excited about listening to all of your experience and your research, but maybe you can start by introducing yourself. You have a quite nice title there.
Yeah, so I am a productivity engineer here at Microsoft, and I actually work in our internal engineering systems team. And so the entirety of my job is looking at how I can help make our internal engineers happier and more productive in their work. And so I do a lot of research trying to explore all of the factors, both technical and cultural, environmental, organizational, that impact developer productivity and well-being, and then see what we can do to address those.
Fantastic. So I would say personally, or I think we all kind of experience this. I mean, we tend to talk about productivity, it's very easy to tell when you're not productive. But then you end up in these situations where you are not super productive. And when you're trying to address it, it's really hard to break it down into something tangible, something meaningful, something that really can be actionable. So maybe you can start introducing how you think about this. And I think also you have a specific framework, the SPACE framework, that really are tied in together with this.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, in order for me to do my job, I can't even start unless I have some way to even define what productivity is. And over the years, I have come to the viewpoint that productivity is not one thing. There's never going to be this one measure of productivity that we can look at. It means very different things. It spans multiple dimensions. And so I had the great fortune back in 2021 to collaborate with some amazing researchers, including Nicole Forsgren, on the SPACE framework. And what SPACE proposes is that productivity spans multiple dimensions. And the dimensions that we included as part of our framework were satisfaction, which is this notion of, are developers feeling happy? Are they growing? Are they feeling fulfilled and motivated, engaged? It is performance. And so this is thinking about the outcomes, the customer and business outcomes of the software you're producing. You can produce a lot of software, but if no customers want it, was that really a productive effort? It is activity. And so when people think about productivity, they often think about how much work is happening, how many PRs are being completed, how many lines of code are being written, which in isolation, I think are garbage metrics of productivity. But when taken into consideration with these other dimensions can be useful indicators. So moving on, we also have C, which is for communication and collaboration. It's this notion of, are we building on others' work? Are we allowing others to build on our work? Are we working effectively as a team? It's, you can have incredibly productive individuals, but if they aren't helping the teammates around them, then you're not going to be more than the sum of your parts. And then the E in SPACE is for efficiency and flow. And so are devs able to do their jobs without interruption or with limited interruptions and limited context switches, without having to fight against friction coming from their dev tools or inefficiencies coming from their work processes? And so with that, we say, okay, we have these 5 dimensions of SPACE. And so when you're thinking about how to even just measure productivity, teams and organizations should think about not just measuring across any one dimension, but measuring across multiple dimensions in order to get a more holistic picture.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. When you were mentioning the activity, I mean, that's the first one that comes to mind, that you are doing something, you're doing the pull request, you're doing whatever. Just curious, how does this translate into the DORA metrics?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. And Nicole Forsgren was, instrumental in coming up with DORA and was the primary author on the space framework as well. And I think of DORA as a framework really looking at sort of deployment efficiency, sort of system level efficiencies. And are we able to effectively move all of this code that we created out to customers, and how sort of high quality and stable is that code? How quickly can we respond to any issues, things of that nature? And I think space is a zoomed out view, if you will, a larger umbrella that takes into account more of how did we create that code to begin with? And then it also has more of an individual and sort of team level, human level aspect to it. And so I think these things, like, they go hand in hand. I think DORA complements space.
So would it be correct to say that the space were more for looking at the organization per se, more for the management maybe, or maybe more, maybe not management, because that sounds like a bit kind of top down, but, looking at the more HR, how do we operate as a team? How do we work together as a team? Whereas the DORA is more kind of how does the system actually come together? Do my pipeline work, or is it automated well enough, and all of that? Would that make sense, or am I off now?
Nope, I think that's perfect. That aligns very well to my mental model.
So if we go into a bit more detail on the space model, I really are finding that very interesting, by the way. How is there any difference on the individual contributors, or let's say the developers, and how they feel about this, or wouldn't say feel about this space, but more their take on how well do they perform along those dimensions versus the more, let's say, management level, when management is using this as their, I would say, measurement on how well are we as an organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so one of the things I was interested in is looking at, does space align to how developers actually think about their own productivity? And so I had, again, the great fortune to partner with some amazing researchers, where we ran a study within Microsoft where we asked engineers across the company, how do you define productivity in your own words? We didn't give them the space dimensions or anything like that. We just said, hey, verbatim text, tell us what productivity means to you. We then took all of those responses and then we coded them against the space dimensions. And we wanted to see, in their own words, do developers really think about productivity across all these dimensions? And what we found is, yes, developers really do think about productivity across all 5 of the space dimensions. And for a given individual, their definition of productivity may span 2 or 3, or sometimes even all 5 dimensions. And so an individual's definition of productivity can be incredibly nuanced. And it also is incredibly different. If you ask 100 devs, what is productivity to you? You're going to get 100 different answers. And so not only, is it multiple things, but it's different buckets of multiple things to different people. And where we really saw differences is, as you sort of, I think, caught on to there, is between managers and individual, what we call individual contributors, the actual software engineers. We see that there's a lot of tension in the definitions, where managers are disproportionately likely to view productivity through the lens of these outcomes, the P in the space dimension, and developers are a lot more likely to view productivity through the lens of output. How much work did I produce? Not necessarily what were the business outcomes of that work. And turns out that those groups don't always necessarily know that they're not aligned. Developers often don't realize that their definition is wildly different than their managers. And that can create problems when thinking about things like reward outcomes. It's like, oh, well, I think I'm doing a great job, but the things that you think you're great at might not be as important to your manager. And so making sure you have open communication is incredibly important.
So talking about how to use this and also productivity in general. So there is this big buzz around in the industry these days, the chat GPT and the AI and open AI. And so what is your take on how is this going to impact everything? Are we kind of turning everything upside down, or how is this going to impact us?
I mean, things are
If
moving.
if you know.
Yeah, like anyone who says that they know is wrong, right? Like things are moving so fast, it has proven to be impossible to predict. But space gives us a really interesting lens to evaluate these changes. Theoretically, AI should be removing friction in our workflows, and we should see that across all of the spatial dimensions. Like AI has the ability to help us with our well-being, to help us learn and grow. And as a developer, like AI should be able to look at the work I'm doing and say, oh, hey, we recommend you take these training courses and you go and learn along these aspects. It should be able to certainly help us synthesize and better articulate customer requirements, drive up that performance. Certainly AI should remove a lot of friction in our development workflows. So we should see, efficiency go up, activity should go up. Even things as simple as, Microsoft is a gargantuan company, and we have some very, very large code bases. Windows, as an example, we think is the largest Git repository in the world by quite a bit. And so it's really difficult to know who is working on all the different parts of the code. And so AI should be a tool that should be able to help us say like, oh, hey, do you know that someone else is doing something very similar at this very, very far-flung part of the code base? And so maybe you need to go and connect with them. And so I think we're going to see that a lot of how we do our jobs is going to change in ways we can't predict, but space gives us the lens for which we should evaluate those changes. And are they giving us the benefit that we want to get out of them?
Absolutely true. And I think we are just up front of a big wave here, and there's a lot of learnings and experiences to be made in this space. But something or one kind of going back to the pandemic introduced remote work for sure. Everybody was forced into remote work overnight, more or less. So in your research also, how does remote work coming into productivity?
Yeah. And so again, this is a place where having a framework like space can be helpful because it gave us multiple lenses to look at the impact of, fundamentally changing the way we work. And a great example of this, so Microsoft historically had been a come into the office virtually every day kind of company. Like remote work was, if you have a repairman coming in for the day, you can work remotely that day. But in general, you're in the office every day. And so it was a new way of working for everybody. And what we found is over the first couple of months that we shifted into mandatory remote work, we could see that our developers were doing a tremendous amount of work. We could see pull requests per person after controlling for size and complexity was up like 20% compared to the year before. And at the same time, we also saw, our stock price was shooting up, and we could see like, oh, hey, we're doing more work. That work is yielding more positive business outcomes. Surely we're being more productive, right? And it's like, no, you just have to go and talk to a developer and find out you weren't being more productive. Developers, we were miserable at that time. It was the early days of the pandemic. Everyone was feeling lonely and isolated. We didn't know what our team was doing. We were working 14 hours a day because there was nothing else to do because we were all in quarantine. And so space gave us this lens to talk about this, where it's like, yeah, we were doing a bunch of work and that work was yielding good business outcomes, but it wasn't sustainable. Like we weren't going to be able to last. We need to think about things like work-life balance. And so once we started to look at things through these different dimensions, we could find different ways to alleviate some of these problems. And how do we rethink our vacation policies and things like that in order to make sure we're not burning out? How do we think about social engagements and social dynamics around teams, things like that? And so in general, as now lots of time has gone on, I have found that remote work is incredibly personal. There is no one size fits all. What works well for one person doesn't work well for another. And so when I see organizations saying, oh, remote work is less productive, to me, that hints that those organizational leaders are viewing remote work through their own personal lenses. At Microsoft, I've done a couple of studies One was a survey of 5,000 engineers. And what we found is nearly exactly equal numbers of people said they felt more productive during remote work. And about 50% of people said they felt less productive during remote work. If I just look at output, if I look at pull requests, I can see that 50% of developers did more pull requests once they shifted to remote work, and about 50% did less. And so, what works well for one person doesn't work for another. And so that's why something like hybrid work should be perfect, because it's going to allow everyone to work in the way that they work best. And so just finding what works for you as an individual is what's going to allow you to be productive. Now, that's not to say there aren't still lots of challenges that we haven't solved with remote and hybrid work, but it is incredibly personal. And for people that work well in remote work, they can be just as effective, if not more effective.
Yeah, but what is your take then on, there is a lot of discussions going on in the industry, whether or not you want to have people in office or you want to kind of embrace the remote first? Because, hybrid is good, but it also has its own flavor of challenges.
Yeah, like all things, there are trade-offs, and there are a lot of advantages with remote work for both the employee and the employer. You can draw from a much wider talent base because you're not sort of limited by where you have physical locations. Employees love the flexibility that remote work affords them. But the trade-off is there does seem to be an irreplaceable value in this human contact. We have not found a digital way to replace some of the social interactions. And we certainly found during remote work that missing social interactions with your peers was the number one most frequently cited work challenge for engineers. About 80% of Microsoft engineers said that they were missing social interactions with their peers. Collaboration is tough. And so, one of the things we, like as an industry, are going to need to figure out is how we balance these things. And maybe the answer is, we just need to make sure we bring the whole team together once every 6 months or once every quarter or once every year. Or we may find that no, it's actually best if we bring everyone together 2 times a week, but there are trade-offs with that. And we're either willing or not willing to make those trade-offs. Now, the one exception to all of this are new hires. I will say that new hires in particular struggle to onboard during remote work. We continue to see across the industry, they struggle to onboard during hybrid work because they don't have the existing social capital to draw down. I've been at Microsoft for nearly 17 years. I have built up a lot of social capital that I can spend the rest of my career drawing down. New hires don't quite have that same experience. And so we need to figure out not only how do we balance it for our more tenured employees, but how do we make sure we can effectively grow the next wave of the workforce as well.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. Being a remote first company, onboarding is very, let's say, interesting, particularly challenging, I would say. So any practical advice? You have a new employee, you want to have them, part of the team. You need to really make sure they are onboarded. You are in a hybrid or remote environment. What do you do what is the practical tips that you've seen working with this in Microsoft that we can take away?
Yeah, so it certainly was not lost on me how much we were struggling onboarding new employees. We could see, again, just looking at activity data during remote, when Microsoft shifted to mandatory remote work, we could see that those new employees who were onboarding during that period were producing substantially less work over their first 90 days, on the order of 20%, 25% less work. At the same time, as I tried to dig in to explain why, I saw that they were connecting substantially less. They're, doing an organizational network analysis. They were connecting to far fewer people, far less often. And so what I did is I went and interviewed 24 new hires. And I said, hey, what's going, what went well, what didn't go well? And there was a shockingly few number of consistent traits amongst those new hires who said they had a really great experience. One of them is just normalize asking for help. I had a new hire tell me, I don't know, if I have a question, should I ask it in an IM? Should I send an email? Should I set up a meeting? And so I stress out about it. And since I stress out about it, I end up just not asking that question at all. And it's yeah, if you have anxiety, anytime you have to ask a question to anyone, you're going to hate your job. And so it's looking at how can teams make clear that it's okay to ask for help and which way to ask for help. Also just emphasizing team building, making sure there are, dedicated social interactions amongst the team, like informal sort of online game nights or informal coffee chats, things of that nature. Having an official onboarding buddy or like a technical mentor, someone to help guide the new hire in their onboarding journey, having that dedicated point of contact to give them that human connectedness. Managers having regular one-on-ones. Like when I tell teams how to be more productive, the first tip I give development teams is managers, make sure you are setting aside time for one-on-ones. It is the easiest thing you can do to boost productivity. We see that it has a positive correlation to how much code devs write, is a positive correlation to their job satisfaction, and is a positive correlation to their self-reported productivity. And that is even more true for new hires. And then scope first assignment. So I used to think that something like time to first PR was a garbage productivity metric. I was like, who cares? You can gain it. What does that mean? And then I went and interviewed a bunch of new hires, and I had one new hire tell me, like, until I completed my first pull request, I couldn't speak the language of the team. Like it's not learning my job, it's learning the workflow. And until I'd gone through the workflow, I couldn't fully participate in daily stand-up and things like that. And so having a first pull request assignment is really scoped, even if it's just fixing a spelling mistake, has a ton of value because it A, allows the developer to learn the workflow, and B, like, everyone's got imposter syndrome, or the vast majority of people have some semblance of imposter syndrome. And so just like getting that quick win, getting sort of the stress off your shoulders, is like, no, I actually can complete something, is really valuable. And those 5 tips, those were the consistent themes, and teams that did that well just objectively had more positive onboarding outcomes.
So one thing that comes to mind listening to your tips there, and then experience of being onboarded remotely, and it struggles of reaching out to your teammates, of really making sure you are being included as a team, and being taking your kind of take the space in the team. Did you find any differences, or did you look into the different? They have the typical introvert versus the extrovert. Was that a dimension that could make a difference?
So it's a great question. And one of the things I've been surprised about is how consistently we have heard this notion of missing social interactions amongst all of our engineering base. And so not just introverts, extroverts. I think the balance of what is right for every individual will change, but even some of our more introverted employees still need some collaboration. Like, you need it just to do your jobs. Not to mention, we also need it as a way of fulfilling a human need of social interactions. And I think that there is often a misconception, a sort of a stereotype among software engineering that, like, oh no, everyone's introverts, they like to just like close themselves off and not interact. It's like, that's just not modern software engineering. And I also don't think it's modern. I just don't think it's a modern way of thinking about people's personality types. It's like, no one is purely introverted versus purely extroverted. Like, we all have sort of waves on that spectrum. And like, one of the things we found during remote work is, so we ran a study, Tale of Two Cities is what we called it, best of times, worst of times. And we asked 5,000 engineers, how has your productivity changed? How has your satisfaction changed? What are the biggest challenges you've faced, and what are the biggest benefits you've enjoyed of remote work? And what we found is that individuals who said that they rarely started or ended meetings with informal small talk, that, hey, how are you doing? Like, how was your weekend? People who said they rarely did that, that was the most predictive factor we found, that someone would report low personal productivity, low team productivity, and low job satisfaction. And so like, these human moments, when looking across our entire population, like, those were more important to a developer's productivity than the quality of their internet connections. And so even for introverts, having some interaction with our team socially is incredibly important, objectively, or quantitatively rather, for our productivity.
So what you're saying is basically just making sure you take the time and space for, have an informal conversation. The topic that you would basically probably do over the coffee or by the coffee machine at the office, that's what was missing in the remote work.
And still is. We haven't found a great way to replace this. It's just like the informal hallway chat. The, hey, how are you doing? There's a great study that I love citing that found that for every 100 feet of overlapping walking paths that academics traveled, their odds of grant acceptance went up 20 to 30%. And that just highlights the like, hey, I'm walking by, like, oh, yeah, like, what are you working on? Oh, that's really cool. Did you think about it that way? Like, it's so beneficial. And we just can't replace that digitally yet. We haven't quite found a way to make it feel organic, because the answer is not more meetings. Like, clearly, like, the answer is not to fill our calendar with more meetings. Missing social interactions is one of the most frequently cited workplace challenges, or at least it was during remote work. Then too many meetings is right up there as well. And so it's, how do we get more out of our social interaction, or our interactions we have? And how do we, just like, how are we more intentional with our interactions, with our collaboration, not how do we throw more meetings on our calendar to fill this gap?
Yeah, I was tempted to ask. I recognize this internally in our company, and I'm sure everybody that listening can recognize similar patterns, that when you start working remote, you tend to be more in meetings because you need alignment, you need to make sure you're catching up. And of course, when you are in office, you can walk by, and if the person seems to be very occupied, you of course respect that and move away. But how do you see similar patterns also in your studies, or is this not just our or mine humble observation?
It is not just your humble observation. It is like, we definitely see that more meetings are making it on the calendar, and it's for a few reasons. A, you're replacing those hallway chats, and so those now become formally scheduled meetings. And at least here within Microsoft, it's very rare to schedule a meeting for less than 30 minutes. Like, that's sort of like the minimum increment. And so what used to be a 5-minute hallway chat, and maybe you'd extend it to 10 minutes with some small talk, now has to be a 30-minute meeting. And so like, those things just fill up the calendar. And not only do you have more of them, but our Microsoft Research Division, they did some studies where they actually like strapped brain sensors up to people and found that remote meetings are more fatiguing as well. And so not only are you having more of them, but they're coming at a higher cognitive cost as well. And so it's sort of a double hit there.
Yeah, I can imagine. So do you have any kind of as we round up this conversation, do you have any practical tip of reducing that fatigue from meetings? I mean, I think we can all remember this, coming out of a day remote work in meetings constantly on Teams or whatever platform you're using, exhausted, very much exhausted.
Yep. It is, and it is particularly true of individuals who manage people. Like their median load has expanded at an even greater rate and pushed their days longer. And I think the biggest tip I can provide is to reduce the total quantity of meetings you have. Focus on those meetings that provide the highest value. Well, how do you do that? One way, just and again, very briefly, is if you find yourself multitasking in a meeting, if you find yourself sending emails or trying to write some code, that's not necessarily you being productive. That's an indication that you are in a meeting you might not have needed to be in to begin with. And so be cognizant of how much multitasking you're doing in meetings, because that's probably a meeting you could have just done offline. You could have consumed asynchronously. And I think some of that comes from not knowing what meetings you need to be in until that meeting already happens. And so having good hygiene about making sure that your meetings have a clear agenda. And so everyone knows what are the things we're going to be discussing, what are the outcomes we're looking for, the decisions we're going to make, so that I can look at that meeting invite and say, you know what, I don't need to be there. I can just look at the notes and see what the outcomes were. Like, I don't have to weigh in on that. And it's also cultural, like making sure that you have a team culture where you don't have meetings where you have to be there just to be seen. And so reducing some of those low quality meetings are what allow you to focus on the higher quality ones, like one-on-ones and some of the dedicated social interactions, and just reduce the overall meeting burden on your calendar, which will reduce that fatigue.
So basically your conclusion is, if you are finding yourself coding in a meeting, you should probably drop out and not be part of that meeting in the first place.
Like in most cases, I do actually genuinely believe that's true. Is like, it clearly wasn't important enough for you to stay fully engaged, unless you're like dealing with a Sev 1 incident, and then like there are always confounding factors, but yes.
course. So it was great to chat with you. I'm just curious, Jared, are there some questions? We did promise the audience to take some Q&As. Let's make sure we have the time to respond to some of them as well.
Absolutely. And guys, if you have any other questions you want to submit, feel free to write them in the comments. We'll get to them. We have plenty of time. So I believe we have our first question. Yeah. So this is from Panchu. Has the productivity average remained the same for hybrid when compared to in-office productivity?
So again, it's incredibly personal at the individual level, but it is my viewpoint that hybrid is interesting. I think that we're still figuring out how to blend office and remote work. Like when we were fully remote, I think the average was slightly higher. I would say while it was about 50-50, the amplitude of the people who were doing better remote, like that was a larger amplitude. Now that we're hybrid, I think that organizations in hybrid, we're still trying to figure out how to do that effectively. And so I think there's still some friction we're seeing. And so I think it's maybe a little bit lower if we look across the industry. I actually have some work coming out about this at our Build conference next month. So everyone tune in. And I do think we're just seeing that nobody has all the answers as it relates to hybrid work yet. And anyone who says they do, like, please send them my way. And we can see that in the data still.
Nice. Cool. And then we have another question, and it looks like it's from Daniel. What do you think about the reliance on SaaS tools we use for remote work today? And do you believe they inspire collaboration the same way as in-office meetings?
I think they're getting a lot better, right? Like we've had 2,000 years to get used to working together in person, and we've had 2 years to learn how to work effectively, sort of remotely or hybrid. And I do not think that all of our remote collaboration tools allow us to do everything as effectively as in office, but they are getting better every time I blink. And so I don't think we're there yet. And I think we see that particularly for creative brainstorming type applications. I think I still hear a lot from developers about missing whiteboarding, and our digital tools, while a lot of them are really good, things like Miro are amazing. The Microsoft Whiteboard app is certainly coming a long way. I think that there's still room to grow.
Yeah, nice. And then we have another question from Panchu. Is some people have different challenges around staying focused, such as those with ADHD. Do you have any strategies in helping them stay productive in a remote environment?
Yeah, it's, we found that remote work, particularly remote meetings, can affect different individuals very differently. That's why things like, oh, should I have my camera on or off during remote meetings can be incredibly personal, because people with different, sort of life viewpoints may view things differently. I will say that in theory, being in a remote environment allows you the greatest flexibility. So you can tailor your day, you can tailor your workspace to the things that will help you. And so ADHD is going to in many ways be exacerbated by going into the office, particularly if you were in a sort of an open team-based space, whereas you have all sorts of distractions around you. But I would think as an individual without ADHD, that remote work should help alleviate a lot of that. But to be honest, I haven't done any dedicated work there, and I am not a medical professional. So sorry, I don't have more constructive tips there.
Very cool. And then we have a question from Roman. It's, what do you think is a good ratio of meeting/focus time when working remotely?
It's a great question. And I don't think there is a magic number, because it's like I said, some meetings are really helpful and some meetings just simply aren't. And that may change based on where you are in the development process. Like earlier on, when you're in planning and brainstorming, you might need more meetings. And so you really just have to always be focusing on not necessarily the ratio, but just how many of your meetings are high quality versus low quality, and try to drive that to they're all high quality. I will say like, I cannot understate the importance of having time booked for focused work. We can see that devs who have more uninterrupted, 2-hour blocks or more of time on their calendars do a lot more coding. They're a lot more engaged. There is a study getting released, in fact, I believe this week at Chai, that we showed that developers who formally blocked time on their calendar for focused work, they did 78% more coding during that formally blocked off time than they do during just like empty blocks of time on their calendar. And so formally setting aside time, blocking it on your calendar, turning off notifications to do focused work is an incredibly powerful tool. Like, boosting your coding by 78% by simply blocking that time off versus just having it be an open block is like, there's nothing else that would give you a gain like that. And so set aside time for focused work, but I can't give you a specific number.
Nice. And it looks like we have a question from Daniel again. How important is a healthy tools culture in enabling things like connectedness and proximity?
Like, incredibly important, and it is for lots of reasons. It is, if you have a bunch of crappy tools that you have to use in your day-to-day, you're just going to be angry. And so like it's hard to feel engaged with your job. It's hard to want to collaborate with your colleagues if you're spending all day fighting against friction in your tools, particularly your dev tools. If you're chasing down hard to understand error messages, if you're constantly fighting against crashes, things of that nature. But our tools can be an aid for collaboration. Like, even just think about things like code review tools. And like, code review are an incredibly valuable collaboration activity, not just to find defects, but to bring transparency into what people are working on in order to transfer knowledge or help teach people new ways of doing things. And so having a healthy tools culture will allow us to invest in things like better code review tools, which boost connectedness. And certainly like proximity is there. I mean, you can have tools around how can we help. At Microsoft, we just released Microsoft Places, which is like, how can we have tools help us sort of coordinate which days we're going to be in the office and things like that. And so tools like help, and tools can certainly hurt if we ignore them.
Yeah, nice. And then we have another question from Panchu. What basic principles do you follow in evaluating measurable productivity for someone?
Oh, this is a tricky one, because like it's my absolute nightmare that any of the things that I do would ever be weaponized against engineers. I think measuring individual productivity is incredibly difficult. I think a lot of what I do is like, as I am measuring productivity, I'm looking at not how do we hold an individual accountable, but how do we hold our internal tooling teams accountable and say, oh, no, if a developer isn't doing more work or doing better work, it is seldom their fault. Developers want to do good work. It is because they have inefficient tools and processes being put in their way, and I should be holding my team accountable. All of that being said, if we're measuring productivity, whether it's at the individual level, the team level, sort of the system level, it's don't measure one thing. Measure across multiple dimensions. Measure the things that you're really going to invest in changing. Don't measure for the sake of measuring. Like, if you want to improve your time to first PR, a metric I mentioned earlier, great, measure that, but only if you're actually going to do things in order to improve that. As a result, then don't be afraid to rotate your measures and reevaluate which ones you keep. Now, you want to be able to track long-term progress and all of those things, but it's measure across multiple dimensions, rotate to the dimensions that are most important to you in the moment, and measure the things that you're actively investing in.
Yeah, very cool. And we have questions are coming in. Cool. So we have a question from Anton. Is overworking a common problem for developers working in a full remote mode? If it's so, how can it be avoided, and what are the potential risks?
Great question, Anton. 78% of all engineers during remote work reported being unsatisfied with their work-life boundary. Remote work seems to exacerbate that because it's so easy to blend work and home. We found Microsoft research found this notion that we call the triple peak, where people will like work in the mornings and then you have a little lunch break and then you work again through the rest of the day, and then you unplug for a little while and then you come back on at 7 p.m. in the evening. And remote work definitely seems to exacerbate this notion of having a healthy work-life boundary. I think being aware of it, like it's something that is in the conversation a lot more than it ever was before. I think remote work in a good way shown a spotlight that it could be problematic. And this is a cultural issue. And so in my org, I write our guiding cultural principles because having a healthy culture will lead to more productive outcomes. And so, one of our cultural principles is around encouraging everyone to take time off to recharge. It is not just good for the individual, it's good for the business. And it is something that leaders need to demonstrate. It's, leaders need to take time off and be very vocal about taking time off and visible taking time off. And it's another bit of advice I give is, this is a place tools can help. In Outlook, at least, you can set what are your preferred working hours. And so when I'm scheduling meetings, when I'm sending emails, I can see, is it inside or outside someone's preferred working hours? And it's, sometimes that can't be avoided, but wherever possible, how do I make sure that I'm not forcing someone else to work outside their preferred working hours? And if it is outside their working hours, how can we maybe do this asynchronously instead of synchronously? But it is, maintaining a healthy work-life balance is incredibly impactful for productivity. People who said that they weren't satisfied with their work-life boundary were twice as likely to say that their productivity had gone down. So it's a great question.
Just a quick follow-up on there before we take the next question. So do you see any relationship between a company where the work-life balance were not super good before the remote work, moving into remote work? So is it the same type of companies that end up in this overly working kind of situations, or did the remote work type of change?
I mean, both. I think what we found is that many of the problems as an industry that we had before remote work just got exacerbated by remote work. Like, I don't know that we as an industry were ever great at onboarding new hires. Like, I don't think that's something we had ever quite figured out. And remote work just made it a lot tougher, as an example. I think people managers and like how we want to effectively use people managers and manage their calendars and like where do we want their attention focused. I don't think we had a great solution sort of universally across the industry. And I think remote work made that worse. And I think that is definitely true for work-life balance. You certainly have some companies who like somewhat take pride in having a crappy work-life balance. It's like, no, we're gonna separate the wheat from the chaff on this. And I think remote work just made that worse. But even for companies that do care a lot about the well-being of their employees, I think remote work still just made things really tough. But those were the organizations that were more motivated to try to find solutions and try to fix it. And there are things that people can do. Like in my team, during the height of remote work, we noticed that individuals were not taking vacation because we are under quarantine, like you can't go anywhere. And so the natural rhythms of stepping away weren't there. And so everyone was feeling burned out. And so what we did is we gave everybody 2 unplanned days off. We called them health days. We gave everyone an unplanned Friday and a Monday, following Monday. And what we noticed is during that 4-day span, the Friday to Monday that encompassed our health days, we saw that pull request volume fell off a cliff. It was about 30% what it was the year before, even though we were a bigger org. And so you're like, okay, the org really took some time to recharge. But what we found is within just 14 days, within just 2 weeks, within just 14 days, 10 business days of those health days, we had made up for all of those lost PRs. So if you zoom out 2 weeks, never would have known the org took 2 days off. But it's not that we immediately snap back to being burned out, to a frantic pace of activity and being miserable again. Burnout was not mentioned as a top theme in my qualitative research for 14 weeks following those health days. And so investing in giving employees time off to recharge doesn't have to come at the cost of productive effort. In fact, it can help make it more sustainable.
Yeah, very cool. And we still have questions coming in. And so the next one is coming from the Hyde. How do you prevent your team's comfort of working from home from solely turning into procrastination? KPIs can be tricked, but quality of work still decreases.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's something that Satya, the Microsoft CEO, has talked about as productivity paranoia. And I don't know that there is any. I have not seen any evidence that this is exacerbated by remote work. I think uh, it is also pretty possible and easy to procrastinate at in the office, and I think it's also easy to make it look like you're working a lot harder in the office than you actually are. And so I think you have individuals who don't take as much pride in their work and maybe aren't as motivated to do a good job. And I don't know that that gets exacerbated with remote work. I haven't, like I said, I haven't seen any evidence that that is true. And about, like I said, like half of all people are in fact less effective working remotely. And so if they're being honest with themselves, they would be better off coming into the office. And so it's sort of helping people feel comfortable making the right decisions for them. But yeah, KPIs can certainly be tricked. Quality of work can still decrease, but I don't know that I've seen that remote work necessarily does that. I think oftentimes of those individuals who prefer working in the office, which is a lot of individuals, they often are viewing things through the lens of their own experiences, and that may make things look worse. But a lot of it is also is maintaining connectedness, is making sure that it's not necessarily that it's the remote work, it's that people are no longer feeling engaged and connected to the team. And so like that's the thing to go and solve for.
Very nice. And then we have our next question. This is from Chintan. This is what suggestions do you have for teams and people managers to create those social interactions in a hybrid environment?
Number one suggestion is you have to find something that feels authentic for your team. Like a forced sort of fake social interaction, like just like, is the worst. Like I never want to go to those. And so like every team is different. What's the culture of your team? I know like on my team, we did a lot of informal sort of online game nights where we played Among Us and trivia games and things like that. And the team absolutely loved it. I know some teams have done things where they send sort of like gift cards out to everyone so they can purchase some food, and they all just get online and share a cocktail and hang out. And so it's finding the thing that works for your team, and it's also making it be something that is part of your ongoing team rhythms, where you're really organizing those social rituals. And the one thing you have to be sort of aware of is like how much you want that to be amongst the individuals, how much you want the manager to be involved. Sometimes like the manager being involved changes the dynamic. And so you want to find individuals on the team who are not people managers to start to try to organize and foster some of this, have that be, something that is a 4% part of their job in order to organize these social rituals. And so it doesn't always fall on the people manager, because then everyone feels an obligation to attend and things of that nature.
Awesome. And then we have a question, another one from Daniel. Do you recommend 4-day work week for high-paced environments, and are you exploring that as a possibility at Microsoft?
It's such a great question, and probably like the number 2 question I ever get.
Right.
So I genuinely believe that a 4-day work week would be more productive. We aren't exploring that as a formal experiment. There's just so much confoundment that would be tough to deal with. And it's just like you have a lot of momentum of like 5-day work weeks sort of fighting against you. I do know that there is some, there have been some great studies, I think primarily coming out of the UK lately around 4-day work weeks. And I suspect that it is going to have a lot of these really positive outcomes, but I haven't looked at it. I would love to do it. Like my dream is to move to like a 4-day work week. I'm a very avid runner. And so that would be like an extra day a week that I could train and just relax full time.
Yeah, very cool. And with that, we're gonna close this off. So, guys, thanks everyone for joining. If we didn't get to your question today, don't worry. Just we will answer it at some point in the chat. If you're joining and the stream is a little bit delayed, or if you're joining at a later time and watching this and still have questions that come up, just write in the chat. We will answer you at some point. Everyone here gets a swag store discount. Go to bit.ly/unleash-swag and then put in the code Microsoft-webinar. Again, the website is bit.ly/unleash-swag, and then the code is Microsoft Webinar. You can choose any t-shirt you want. We are, in fact, on GitHub. Check us out if you haven't. Just look up Unleash. If you know we're there, you love us, like we love you, help us out. Make that love public with a GitHub star. We love them. And we're going to be announcing our next webinar soon. Keep an eye on our social channels on like LinkedIn or Twitter. Just go to the Unleash community if you haven't already. We should also put information on our website at getunleashed.io. Brian, Egil, thanks for joining. This is an awesome conversation. And this is really fantastic, and we'll see you guys around.
Thanks for having me.